I think sending 15 teenagers to, do a mission project somewhere, and I mean, is that moving the needle in terms of, pushing back global lostness in the hardest places among the desperate and the unreached? And well, if that's what you're relying on and saying, is it effective for that end? Well, maybe not, but then it's like, well, is it effective to awaken a heart in people that see the world more globally? Then it's like, well, that's actually like very effective. One of the things that we've learned, and I think this is just kind of intuitive, but you got to say it out loud. Every single long-term worker that we have, they all have one thing in common. And that is that at some point in their life, they were on probably multiple short-term mission trips. And God accelerated something in their heart for his global mission. And so, yeah, in a time where I think there's people that are saying, man, are short-term mission trips nothing but poverty tourism? And is it even really effective? And is it such a burden on the long-term workers that are there and all that stuff? I think we've sort of just rejected some of that. And we've said, man, there is benefit to it for long-term workers, small benefits. But there is a massive benefit for our people's heart as they're kind of drawn more into God's mission.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby, and I'm with Pastor Andrew today. We are excited about today's topic. And today what we're going to be talking about is how to create a long-term sending culture through short-term missions at your church. If people were to ask us, thinking about Breaking Barriers and the mission of Breaking Barriers, like, hey, trying to help churches grow, trying to help pastors grow so that they can go, people will often ask, and actually we've been invited to speak at different things, like how do you create a sending culture at your church? And, what are all the things that you need lined up at your church? And I think a lot of times people think, man, there's this secret sauce in the background that you have some super crazy complex thing that you've set up that's going to kind of create this sending culture. And the fact is some of that's useful, but the reality is that's not really the case. We're thinking about creating a sending culture and sending people out in multiplication. I would say the two big things, if you're just trying to really, what's the shortcut to that? It's focus on your church growing, reaching people, growing where you're at, and that's going to ultimately can have an overflow of sending. And the other thing to focus on the back end would be short-term mission trips. And that's surprising for some people that is, for us, one of the primary focuses to create long-term missions, church planning, all of that. It's a very straightforward thing. Any size church can do it. And I'll hand it over to you.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that sometimes what has kind of gotten floated is short-term trips end up being a substitute for long-term sending. Mm-hmm. And it's like churches are settling for short-term trips, when they need to be thinking about what's going to be long-term impact and how much impact can we really do in a week. And, there's this kind of, there's almost been a little bit of a negative vibe, I think, around like short-term trips. Like, are they, but we would say the questions that are being asked that cast them in a bad light are bad questions, because the questions are almost always, are they effective? Well, effective for what? What we're saying is, man, they are incredibly effective for stirring a heart that might one day long-term want to be on the field and really support the mission of God all over the world. I think sending 15 teenagers to, do a mission project somewhere, and I mean, is that moving the needle in terms of, pushing back global lostness in the hardest places among the desperate and the unreached? And well, if that's what you're relying on and saying, is it effective for that end? Well, maybe not, but then it's like, well, is it effective to awaken a heart in people that see the world more globally? Then it's like, well, that's actually like very effective. One of the things that we've learned, and I think this is just kind of intuitive, but you got to say it out loud. Every single long-term worker that we have, whether they have planted a church, or whether they are church planners in an international context. They're missionaries primarily with the International Mission Board in our stream. They all have one thing in common, and that is that at some point in their life, they were on probably multiple short-term mission trips, and God accelerated something in their heart for his global mission.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, in a time where I think there's people that are saying, man, are short-term mission trips nothing but poverty tourism, and is it even really effective, and is it such a burden on the long-term workers that are there and all that stuff? I think we've sort of just rejected some of that, and we've said, man, there is benefit to it for long-term workers, small benefits, but there is a massive benefit for our people's heart as they're kind of drawn more into God's mission.
Yeah, we've talked about this before on the podcast, but it's almost some sort of like logical fallacy that ends up happening with people, because what people do and kind of what you're referring to, it's kind of gone out of style for, some churches to want to do short-term mission trips, because some people, here's what they say. They say, okay, what's the output we're looking for? Mm-hmm. The output we're looking for is to send people long-term, 2 or more years, 3 or more years to, some of the hardest places in the world. Let's just say the 1040 window, Central Asia, Middle East, something like that, right? Where there's no churches, there's not much of a gospel presence. So that's somebody's like end goal. It's like, okay, that's where we're trying to get. That's where we're trying to get. And then the mistake people make is they say, okay, well, we're certainly not going to do a mission trip to Honduras,
right.
where half of the people are reached, because our goal is 1040 window. Our goal is 3 years or more. Our goal is most difficult places in the world. So that's what we need to be focused on. Mm-hmm. And it's just a mistake people make between, like, we've talked about this before, like inputs and outputs, right? Because the output is like, hey, we're trying to send people long-term to really difficult places. And so people say, well, the input can't be a week-long trip, that you could fly 4 hours to Honduras or whatever,
right.
and maybe do VBS and maybe build houses. Like, there's no way that can be the, one of the first steps and that's where just people end up making the mistake.
Right.
They never do that. And so they actually never get a whole lot of that output that they're actually looking for.
Yeah, it's almost like they're viewing the short-term trip as the end game, and we would be saying, no, that's not the finish line. It's a starting line. It's a building block. There are other building blocks. And I think we could talk about some of those, but I mean, if you don't have a good preaching culture around missions and God's heart for all nations and God's global mission, it's going to be tough. If you don't have any back-end systems in terms of, like, when people do get back from mission trips and their hearts are on fire, like, is there next steps for them? It's going to be tough. Like, I get that. There are other more complex things that maybe we need to go around and talk about some, but we would say, like, the top of the funnel, like one of those really big building blocks in the beginning is just the desire that people have for the nations. And maybe nothing can move people's hearts more than being on a short-term trip. I mean, Paul Chitwood is the president of our sending agency in terms of the one that we use mostly, not exclusively, but mostly. Mm-hmm. And the International Mission Board, they did a study that said that if someone had been on a short-term trip, they were 4 times more likely to give to the nations, pray for the nations, or end up going long-term to the nations. Mm-hmm. And when I heard him say that, I'm like, well, that is saying something out loud from a guy who's credible, who's done the work, that I sort of already knew, right? And we've already kind of bought into. We have had a short-term trip culture from the very, very beginning. I mean, we had a goal before our church was 1 year old that we would be paired up with an unreached people group somewhere that we might send multiple trips to them during a year. And we did that. We've done that in Peru for years and years. That's kind of blossomed into other things. But I think it came from us having sort of this intuitive understanding that God does something in terms of pouring fuel on the fire, whenever people get a chance to see what he's doing in other parts of the world.
Yeah, one of the maybe ways to explain this, and one of the reasons I think it's so effective, if we think about like our personal life as just like an illustration, this is kind of helpful for me, and it may be helpful for other people. I recently read just about the idea, I don't know if you've heard about this, like a keystone habit in your life, So let's say in your personal life, whether it's your personal health or, your personal finances or whatever, right? In a lot of those areas, you may have like 20 things that you need to do, right? I mean, I need to do these 20 different things to get healthier, or these 20 different things to get financially healthier. The idea of a keystone habit is trying to figure out, hey, what is one thing that you could really focus on instead of 20 things that's really going to help to kind of lead to all these other things, So a lot of times people in their life, if they start eating better, right, or drinking enough water or getting enough sleep, it's something that ends up kind of leading to all the different things in their life.
For sure.
And it's different for different people, but equating that over to the church, I think it's the same thing with, a lot of pastors. They want to see like the Great Commission, planting churches, sending missionaries. And when you think about that, you easily could make a list of 50 things that you need to do, right? It's like, man, we got to raise money and we got to create systems, and man, I got to mentor the people that do feel called, and like it could end up being like 50 things, And the idea of a short-term mission trip is like, hey, but are there some keystone habits? It's like, hey, it's not super complicated. There's not a list of 50 things. Is there a keystone habit maybe that you could do that could end up leading to all the other things? And I just think it's kind of a good way to think about it. Yeah,
I mean, we have a goal of seeing 300 people on short-term mission trips this year from our church. Now, if your church was a tenth of the size, you might send one team, or you might send 30 people, or what, like those numbers are all going to be relative to where you are and all that. Right. The point is, when we're thinking about a year, and just vision for the year, that number of people that are on short-term trips is very high on our list of vision things that we're talking about. The reason is because, man, if you build, we believe that idea, if you build in that habit, man, this is something that we do, it's going to end up trickling down as people's hearts get set on fire for the nations. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about here, and this is sort of where this podcast is going to go, we want to set up the value of it. And then, in a few different facets, we believe that short-term trips are one of the most valuable things in terms of igniting ascending culture in your church. Not the only thing, but it's one of the most important, especially in a day when people are kind of moving away from these things, sort of, or have. So let's just talk for a little while about the value of it. I've got three things I talked to our staff about in terms of the value of short-term trips, and I want to set them up this way. The first two are both about 5% of the value. Okay, so we're going to do three of them, two of them, 10% of the value. The third one is the 90%. And if people have been listening closely, they can probably already guess a little bit of what that is. But the first two, and I want you to talk about this, like the first two of these are going to be more in the, was it effective for the mission bucket, external. The third one is going to be a little more internal in terms of, was it effective for the discipleship of our people? I think some people look at mission stuff, and if you were to say out loud, hey, the majority reason why we do short-term missions is for our people's discipleship, for them to catch a bigger heart, for them to, I think some people would balk at that immediately because it wasn't effective for the mission, What do you think about that?
Yeah, like it just kind of depends on how you define it and what like the long-term goal is, because I understand how sending, somebody halfway around the world for a week, they spend 3 days traveling, they don't know the language, yada, 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 how that is maybe not as effective as somebody that's living there. They understand the language, they understand the culture, all of that, right? So it's easy to say, well, yeah, that's not as effective as it could be. But it's effective in a different way, like you're saying, because long-term,
right.
If long-term effectiveness is more people that are willing to move to those places and immerse themselves in the culture, learn the language, partner with people there from that culture that are believers, it's like, well, that's long-term effectiveness. It's almost just like, I think, just like viewing it in too much of a short-term thing when somebody thinks, well, there's no way we're going to be able to make, an impact flying halfway around the world for 7 days or 10 days or whatever. A little bit just the wrong way to think about it. Like you're saying, like you're already kind of framing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way you could say it is maybe the greatest effectiveness for the mission is the discipleship of our people. It's like, man, if they are growing in their discipleship, that probably is going to end up producing the greatest, because it ain't even just about if they go long term. Like Chitwood said, give and pray. Man, if you got people that are like, hey, I'm gonna become a prayer warrior for South Asia for the next 30 years because I was on this trip and because I made some relationships over there, who knows what God's gonna do with that?
Right.
I mean, if it's true that maybe all God does is an answer to prayer, you know, I mean, that's a little bit of an overspeak way to say it, but we move the hand that moves the world. How can you put a number on that? Or how can you put an effectiveness thing on that? Same thing with giving. I mean, I think one thing that I think is also said about short-term trips is they're not efficient. Like you mentioned, you know, okay, you're going to travel for 3 days. Every family is going to spend, you know, we just had 30 people on a trip to Thailand where we were doing some stuff with some long-term workers from another part of the world. And we took 30 people over there.
Right.
I mean, I don't even know how much money it cost. I mean, everybody had to raise probably $3,000 to fly, and then our church invested a ton of money in it. I mean,
you could have been giving that money some other.
Yeah, exactly. You could have given it away. You could have done. People would say, "Man, that's not an efficient use of the money." And I'm like, "Well, for what we think we get for it, it's an incredible use of the money."
Yeah. People are thinking about it the wrong way.
I think so, and I would say even what we get in the five buckets, like I said, like the 5%, I think that's even worth it. And then the 90.
What would you say are those?
I would say the 5% buckets are when you're thinking about the mission effectiveness, and I'll go through all three of these, but the first two are, man, short-term trips encourage long-term workers. And then the second one is short-term trips multiply the time of long-term workers. If that's all you got from it, I still would probably do it. Mm-hmm. But then the third one is the one that I want to camp on, and maybe we'll even kind of carry this over to another podcast. That third one is the one we want to camp on, which is like, man, short-term trips ignite a passion in our people for long-term work. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, when you get that, we think they're incredibly valuable. So, value of short-term mission trips, the first thing I would say is this: short-term trips encourage long-term workers. You and I both know this because we have many friends. We both went to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We had friends from there that went Middle East, India, places. Now we're in a position 12 years in at Mercy Hill, we're sending our own. I mean, it feels like we're sending our kids. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of these people got saved at Mercy Hill. We've been walking with them for 10 years, and then boom, now they're heading to the nations, right? And we know that they are going to live under immense pressure. Man, these are people that are going to live with their backs against the wall every single day in terms of, man, just being in the most lost places on earth. Everything we face with our kids and with families, they're going to face, except they're going to be doing it in a language they don't know, without any family around, you know, places where they can't, everything is foreign. And then not to mention, man, for many of them, the work is slow and it's hard, and they maybe don't get to see some of the fruits that we get to see that keep people encouraged. They live under immense pressure. They need encouragement. Short-term trips, I think one of the most valuable things about them is just that we get to go and relationally be with our long-term workers and kind of one another with them, man, sharing their burdens, sharing their joy, be normal around them, man, give them a chance to kind of immerse back into their own culture and language for just a little while and just sort of be friends and encourage them.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to explain this, I think, for if someone's never experienced this or got to see it from a missionary getting to experience this, you know? Mm-hmm. Like when a missionary goes overseas, sometimes it's just because wherever they're going is inherently just a hard place to be. Other times it's just because it's just different, you know? It's just, I mean, for any of us, no matter where we were raised or what culture we were raised in, if we were just plucked from that and put somewhere else, like you're saying, different traditions, different language, just different everything, you know, just the way that you think and the way that things operate, and maybe the car driving on the other side of the road, just everything is different. Mm-hmm. That is such a shock to the system, you know, and a lot of people that are, you know, long-term missionaries, they're just some of the most amazing and flexible and entrepreneurial sort of people in the world. And maybe they can handle that stuff better than most people. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, just bringing a little taste from home, you know, even sometimes when it's just in the form of, you know, a food they can't get there or something other that we take so for granted that is so basic. You know, I mean, sometimes you put that in the hands of a missionary and, you know, they're like shedding tears because they're getting to... Right. You know, eat this sauce or eat this food they can't get. And it's like, because it's just hard, you know, being in totally different culture and different language and just everything about it. And just getting to be around people from where you're from your church. I mean, same language. I mean, you really can't overstate, I think, how effective it is just to encourage.
Yeah, short-term trips encourage long-term workers who need encouragement. I mean, we all do, but I mean, think about, where they are and how hard it can be and dealing with the same stuff we deal with, but doing it in a foreign context. The story that I told our staff, I'll tell now without any names or anything, but we had one family that over, they were in country, in context, very hard place in the world. Okay. And every missionary will tell you the same thing. When they're new in a country, they feel like a baby. They can't do anything themselves. They can't speak the language. That's what they feel like. And praise God, the couple got pregnant, and man, they were excited about that. It's a lot. You're thinking about you're new in the country and all that. And where they are is a very rural place, and the doctors in that rural place examined her one time and said, "Your child has Down syndrome." That's a shock, man. I mean, for me, I know that more than others. We have a child with Downs, and that's tough, man. You start reading about life expectancy and just all this. And so, dude, they're reeling. They're not in a way that's like, I mean, dude, they're excited about the baby. And I mean, we understand fearfully and wonderfully made, but it's a challenge. They're getting their mind ready for it because now it's a high risk pregnancy. They have to go to the major city, which is a flight. Okay. So they go to the major city to do the high risk pregnancy thing. Cause now with this kid with Downs, only to have that doctor tell them, no, actually your baby doesn't have Downs. That was a misdiagnosis. And oh, by the way, you're not going to get the medical care you need in where you are. You just can't. You're a Westerner. You can get on a plane and come. You need to do that. Some people can't. You can. It needs to happen. It's like, dang, So now it's like, okay, me and Bobby, you have 3 kids. I have 4 kids. Like every time our wives had to go to the doctor, which is like every month or whatever.
Go get on a plane.
Now she's on a plane. All right. So she does that for 8 months, up until 8 months. They get all the way to the 8-month mark. She's allowed to travel up to 5 weeks before. She gets there to the airport. They won't let her on. She has doctor's notes. She's calling the doctor, everything. They won't let her on the plane. You're too pregnant. Why? The guy at the gate just decided, So, and that's just how some of this stuff works. And, it's just, there's nothing they can do. I mean, they just barred them. You're not flying. So, well, what's our option? Well, there's a 17-hour train ride that leaves tomorrow that'll get you to the same city to get to your doctors so that you can get ready. It's like 30 days before the baby's coming. They got to move their whole family. They got all their stuff, all their luggage, other kids. These people are in their 20s. I mean, this is just, I'm at this point going like, man, I don't know how people do. Okay, so they get on the plane, they get on the train with the kids and all the luggage the next morning. Now they're on the 17-hour train ride. The dad is with the other kids. The mom is sitting in a chair in the little cart, no air conditioning. And she's doing breathing exercises for 17 hours because at this point she feels like the stress is going to bring on the baby. They get to their city, which is a mega city. I mean, like mega millions, right? They get there that afternoon. By midnight, she goes into labor. They know nobody in the whole city. Now they're calling the sending organization to say, do you have anybody else around us? Oh yeah, we got this 20-something-year-old girl that's over there for 2 years. They call her. She's like, yeah, I'll be there in a few minutes. So she gets there. It's midnight. The other kids have never met her. So our family, they're already in bed. The kids are already in bed. So our family jumps in the car to try to go find the hospital. They can't speak the language. They're in a mega city trying to find this hospital. And the other girl wakes up the next morning, and they said it was this really weird moment where the other 2 kids walk in the kitchen and she walks in the kitchen and they meet. Never met each other. They get to the hospital, and there's apparently like a pretty big stereotype about Western women that they think the baby's going to come a lot faster than it does. And that, like, I guess in this place in the country, like labor takes 3 days. Well, everybody's like, oh, these women are hysterical, that their baby's about to come. So our missionary is having to grab these people and run them in the hospital and be like, the baby is coming. And she was not joking, and I shared that story with our staff just to tell them our long-term workers need encouragement. How much does that story take out of the tank? And how long does it take to refill the tank after something like that,
Right.
And if it's a short-term trip that brings them that encouragement, it's what we need to do. Let me read, this is crazy when you think about Paul, because Paul needed encouragement too. And in 2 Timothy, he says this to Timothy, do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me, gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in ministry. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Now here's what he says. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and also the books, and above all the parchments, because, and he goes on, I'm not going to read this whole thing, Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. You can read in this passage that Paul is incredibly discouraged. He is not, we know this letter, he is writing from Rome. He is not asking Timothy to relocate his life to take over the ministry in Rome. He's asking Timothy, come visit me on a short-term mission trip. Bring me some things that I need. Bring me some encouragement. Paul's asking for a short-term mission trip. Mm-hmm. A major part of why we do this and how valuable it is because we have a chance to encourage long-term workers. Now, the second thing I would say is this: short-term trips multiply the time of long-term workers. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Bobby, I know your story enough. You've been to some different places in the world. You've been to some hard places in the world. I mean, even right after 9/11, you were in some of those theaters and all that kind of stuff. This idea of multiplying the time, meaning we want to go do the things that they want us to do, not the things that we feel like we want to do because we got some guilt trip about the world is lost. You know what I mean? Because I don't know if you've ever seen this. Like, some short-term mission teams are just gung-ho, we got to save the whole world in this next 5 days. Mm-hmm. And it's like, dude, if I don't share the gospel 100 times and I didn't come here just to hang out with these missionaries, like, I'm coming to do something, I'm coming to do something for the Lord or whatever it is. And it's like, man, I don't know if that's the right attitude. Like, the right attitude might be, hey, we're coming to encourage you, number one. Number two, we're coming here to do whatever you need us to do. Right. We're going to leave. You're still going to live here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you're so right, because people that want to go on a short-term trip, they're so, in a good way, just so belief-oriented. It's just like, there for a reason and there for a purpose. But sometimes the reason is, babysitting the missionaries' kids.
Right.
We're just hanging out with them, or just bringing stuff from home or whatever. Like, you got to get your mind right about, okay, why exactly are we here? Because it's like, man, you're on a short-term trip. You've not invested the energy in learning the language, most likely. And like, yeah, you're not going to be all that effective. If you're judging effectiveness by, you got to be the one to share the gospel and lead somebody to Christ. But if you could encourage the missionary, and that's going to cause them to want to stay longer.
Right.
Because just think about it. There's nothing wrong with this, but when a missionary comes off the field and, most of the time they're probably coming off the field at kind of the height of their effectiveness, because it takes a long time to learn the culture, learn the language, for people to accept you. If it's training national partners, actually meeting those people and developing those relationships. And then if somebody leaves, right, and we send another missionary, well, then that person has to start over, right, and learn the language, learn the culture, develop the relationships. And so it's like, man, if we're able to encourage in a way that's going to keep people there longer, because I think one of the issues, I'm guessing for missionaries, just talking to different missionaries over the years, is like, for missionaries, sometimes it's just hard for them to take a break where they're at, because when it's not your native language, when it's not your culture, like, for missionaries, sometimes they just feel like they can't turn it off, like they can't, because you can't turn off, man, I don't know the language all that well. I don't know the culture all that well. I don't have that many relationships. And that's one of the things I think that makes it so hard. Where us, in our context, it's like, man, we can work hard for 5 days, and then we can just kind of turn it off and just say, man, I'm just going to chill for 2 days. That's harder for missionaries in a lot of different contexts. And so if a team somehow can just help them to be more healthy, then maybe they stay longer.
Yeah, we had a team last summer that their whole deal was they went over, and for 1 week, we sort of took over this orphanage that they, these missionaries are running, and man, highly evangelistic, and the stories that have come out of this place are pretty amazing for the gospel. And what you're saying is exactly right. It's like some people might say, well, how many people did you share the gospel with, or how many? It's like, well, nah, man, they were serving meals and holding babies so that this long-term couple could go and be on a bit of a retreat and take their staff away, just like we would want to do, and not be worried about. And so, yeah, that's one of the things I think that we want to just kind of try to hit is like, we feel like there is an effectiveness part of a trip. It's not just about your people in their discipleship. I think it's mostly about that. But the effectiveness part of the trip is probably going to be centered around encouragement and then us being there for them, not the other way around. Because I have heard from a lot of missionaries, man, you have a short-term team and like the missionary needs a vacation after the short-term team was there because
they're burdened by it.
Yeah, they're burdened. And it's like the short-term team probably had this attitude of like, you guys are here for us. You know, like we've come here and we've sacrificed our, week's vacation, and you guys are here to make sure we get our money's worth out of our mission, and we just want to try very hard to have the exact opposite attitude than that. Whatever it is, if it's prayer walking, great. If it's canvassing, great. If it's keeping kids so launch team members can go and make contacts somewhere else, great. If it's helping, drink chai and little tea shops in order that college students would maybe have an in or whatever with the people that work there, great. I mean, that whatever we want to do, it's not glamorous stuff. It's just whatever we can do to help. I've thought about this with that passage I mentioned in 2 Timothy. Like, Timothy is a rising star. I mean, he is a young pastoral outreach magazine, whatever. Like, right. He's like the young kind of rising star. We talk about Timothy a lot. And I just can imagine Timothy sitting on the airplane, with his little t-shirt on that talks about what trip they're going on and all this stuff. And, with all of that in him, with all the ministry experience, everything he's done. And they say, hey man, you're going on a mission trip. Yeah. What are you guys going to go do? And he's like, man, you'll never believe it. I'm bringing Paul a jacket,
Right.
He's got some papers he needs me to bring him, and I'm going to go hang out, dude, and we're going to like talk and stay up late, and man, I'm going to try to make sure he's got something to eat good for a couple days, and then I'm going to fly home back to Ephesus.
Right.
And it's like we would go, man, that's not what we think in terms of like the glamour of a mission trip. What did you do? But that's the way we ought to be thinking about it. Our attitude on a trip is we are here for you. Those long-term workers that are there. And one thing I would say, and we can maybe end it with this, one thing I would say is this is why it is so important to have good partnerships with places that you're sending your people to. Because if you're going to have the attitude of we are here for you, you better trust whoever's over there. I mean, you're sending your people into their hands to say, whatever you need us to do for a week, let's do it. Because missionaries are not immune from other problems like you see in ministry or in just life in general. There can be bad missionaries,
right?
Be lazy missionaries. I mean, that just because you have that title doesn't inherently mean that all of them are knocking it out of the park. We certainly have great relationships with many missionaries, and we believe in our sending boards, and we believe in a lot of the people that have come out of North Carolina. But I just think it's very important that we are vetting who we're partnering with, because we want to have the right attitude when we're there and be very trustful of them.
Yeah, man, that's really great. We're gonna hit more of this in another episode. Just to kind of review today's episode, like a lot of people think, man, I'm not sure about short-term missions because of the effectiveness that it's actually going to be, and we talked a little bit about that. What we're going to get into in another episode is you got to kind of measure effectiveness in a different way, because in terms of long-term effectiveness, the more people that are willing to go long-term is what's going to be most effective. And short-term trips play a crucial role in people catching the vision for what it may look like for God to call them to go to a different place. So we'll just stop. We'll stop right there and pick it up in another episode.